Barigani, Karibuni, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Kumbukeni family. We're happy to have you here with us again. Today we have another African hero teaching us lessons. Again, before we start, my name is Nduku. I am one of the co-hosts on Kumbukeni, a Black African woman who has had it with the colonialist, imperialist, exploitative, whatever you want to call them, doing harm entities in Africa, and I'm decided to do something about it. Joined by my brothers, Adesoji, Milton.
Yes, Akudede Woyi, as we'll say in Yoruba, which is good evening to everybody. Yes, reaching you from the belly of the beast, the mother of all empires, the one on which the sun never sets, the one in which gave you the language in which you're all going to converse in today.
Sounds like you're praising them.
God save the king.
Exactly.
Lord have mercy.
God save the king. And yes, reaching you all from London, good evening and welcome again to another podcast episode of Kumbukeni. Over to you, Brother Milton.
Yes. Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades from wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to our weekly university, Chokiku. Chokiku is like a
look at you.
I remember Tanzania.
Vizuri sana.
Yes, Kumbukeni, where we recall the lessons of our beloved ancestors and the blueprint that they left for us as we weigh some of the challenges we face today. I'm Milton Allimadi from the United States, based here in New York. We are watching the decline of another empire. We are living it every day, every moment. And some of the issues we discuss are actually some of the manifestations of that decline. Back to you, sister.
I don't think the entity is aware yet. Someone hasn't sent them the memo. We need to put that memo together. Either that or they're in denial. They're trying to hold on to every possibility of keeping it alive. So we'll start off with Brother Adesoji. He is well versed on Thomas Sankara. If any of you ever have a question on Thomas Sankara, that is the person to reach out to. And so because of that, we said, you know what, Adesoji, tell us about Thomas Sankara.
Yes, Thomas Sankara began his speech on July 29, 1987, with the following sentence. I come to you and I speak to you about the problem that plagues the entire continent, the one of debt. The man who stood up to speak on that day was born December 22nd, 1949, in a small town, Yako, central Upper Volta. He would go to a town called Gao, where his father, a soldier, was based, where he would grow up. He worked in the church, as any diligent Catholic will do. He impressed the Catholic Church so much that they thought he was going to become a priest. But he eventually told them no. And the local priest will say to his father, apparently you didn't pray enough. That's why Thomas didn't join us. But Thomas' part was different. Thomas will go to a secondary school called Lycée in a place called Bois d'Iasso. And from there, he will join the military academy, which would begin to chart the course which would bring him in contact with the world. He first served in a place called Madagascar. And in Madagascar, he learned the power of the military as a social force for good. He came back home and, being outspoken, he was given a couple of assignments at which he excelled, and because of which he became noticed as the voice of reason and the voice of people. So it is not unsurprising that in 1983, on August 4 to be exact, there was a coup in Burkina Faso, and that coup brought to power the man we all know as Thomas Sankara. So Thomas Sankara will go on. He became what I would call a practical revolutionary. He not only have the ideals, but he also know how to carry them out. And so, which brings us to the issue of debt today, which is the title of his speech, A United Front Against the debt. Thomas Sankara understood that without a concerted effort on the part of the military, the African heads of state, the issue of debt will continue to plague the African continent. And as we can all see today, uh, Africa's debt runs into hundreds of billions,
Mm-hmm.
and well, some of it largely, has frittered away back into the coffers of those who borrowed or said money, and we will touch on that. But what was stirring about that speech was he said something, and that statement stays with me. And he said, "If I go it alone, then there is not likelihood that I will be here next meeting. But if we come together and form a united front, we can, state whatever our case is." And he also couched his statement in the fact that if you have money to pay, why simply don't go to your creditor and pay off said debt? You don't hold on to the debt. Suffice to say, 3 months later, October 15, 1987, in his office, he would hear gunshots outside. He hissed, "What is this all about?" He goes out, and he was immediately fell in a hail of bullets. And so, question is, why? Which is one of the reasons we're going to delve into today, and also the issue of debt as it plagues the African continent. So, over to you, Sister Nduku.
Thank you so much, Adesoji, for that introduction. And Baba Sankara has been with us on several conversations. He's going to feature, this is one of those people that will always come up in an African conversation. To quote his exact words, he says, "The debt is another form of neocolonialism, one in which the colonialists have transformed themselves into technical assistants." And we will base our open conversation today on that statement. And recently I was on LinkedIn going about my revolutionary business, because I don't have any borders as to where I present my intolerance with the imperialists. And Dr. Vandana Shiva, who we hope to have here one day, who is very much out there talking about the dangers of GMO and healthy food production and food sovereignty and all that safety as far as the original seeds, says the exact same thing. She says that this is current neocolonialism. This is colonialism in another form, talking about they figured out a nice way where, yes, they're not killing us with guns. They're still doing that, but it's not the main way. They're not enslaving us, but they have enslaved us financially through these policies, through our dependency. Like, we don't even see that we ourselves are capable without these entities, and we're so dependent on aid. And aid is not aiding us, it is enslaving us financially. So, Brother Milton, Adesoji, let's go at it. We have about an hour and a half, a little less than an hour and a half. Let us inform the audience of what's going on in Africa with the debt, the financial situation, the economic situation, and who is at fault, and what we as Africans can do to start resolving these issues.
Okay, so greetings once again, sisters and brothers. Thank you for that question, comrade. I looked it up quickly, Adesoji. The total external debt in 2021 for African countries, $727 billion. So, sister, you mentioned a couple of things. First of all, that was a good quote that you read from Sankara in terms of this being a continuation of colonialism. It is neocolonialism. Essentially, it's the continuation of transfer of wealth from Africa to the countries that have always benefited from that type of transfer, beginning with the transfer of wealth during slavery, during colonialism, and now during neocolonialism. So it's essentially redistribution of wealth from Africa to the industrialized, developed economies And this is only one aspect of the many forms. So we have to see it in that broader context, you know. So when we're servicing the debt, we're paying the interest, we're servicing the interest, and that's what debt servicing. We're just paying the interest, actually. We're not even paying the debt itself, because they would prefer to keep it that way. Even if African countries woke up and, you know, there was $800 billion just sitting somewhere, and they said, okay, we want to pay off the total external debt, that would not be acceptable, because that would be a significant loss of income from that day onward to the countries that have loaned the billions to African countries. It would result in mass unemployment, you know, because they depend on that income from servicing the debt. And that is essentially what it is. It's you mentioned the word dependency, and that's what it really is. Sankara was killed because he dared to advocate that Africa should become independent and not continue to be dependent by servicing this debt. And when I said that was only one aspect of the transfer of wealth, the others that we've discussed before, of course, is when we, our minerals and raw resources are bought at a very cheap price. That's another way of transfer of wealth. When we buy the inflated, in terms of the price relative to our exports, manufactured products from these countries, that's another way of transfer of wealth. When we provide cheap labor for their companies that locate and build factories that they own. So even though they're located in African countries, it doesn't count toward our industrialization because it's only located there, but it's owned by the multinationals. That's another way of transfer of wealth. So you see now the totality of this plunder that is being directed against African countries. And that's the problem. And as Adesoji said, Sankara said, we are not strong enough to go individually. And he predicted it, he really did. He predicted his death. You know, they didn't even give him a chance to renounce the debt, you see? But the mere fact that he had spoken
about threatened
at the Organization of African Unity meeting in Addis Ababa in 1987, they said, no, this one needs to be removed.
Removed, yeah.
It needs to be eliminated.
But he not only spoke, which is probably why his threat was bigger, because some people like me are going around speaking, but he literally did it in his own country, in Burkina Faso. He said goodbye to the IMF. He didn't say no to the debt, but he said goodbye to more debt. And he told the IMF, we got this. But as you were talking about those companies in Africa, and I was going through the research yesterday, and I was speaking to a friend, and they were saying, why are you surprised? Carnegie Mellon and Princeton University, and I'm sure many others, have campuses in Africa. Did you know that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was very shocked to see that. And other companies came up, and I was thinking to myself, why would these companies, I mean, I knew because of the exchange rate. I'm like, they are definitely exploiting Africa because they get to go there, have the same services at a lower cost, and continue what they're doing, and continue the miseducation of the African and controlling.
Those companies, okay, that's the part that not so much the exploitation part, the miseducation part for those companies.
Mm-hmm.
The companies that are really exploiting are the ones who go there and sign these contracts, and African governments get royalties of like 5 to 10% in some cases. Those are the real culprits that we need to expose and continue denouncing. And in fact, in a future show, I think we should devote into looking at some of these contracts, some of these very egregious, outrageous contracts.
We do it company by company?
I think we should do it focusing on a few countries that have immense resources. So let's look at the contracts that Congo is negotiating, Zambia is negotiating, Ghana is negotiating. Yeah.
And to buttress your point with regards to the economic exploitation using companies, it's important to know that the last somebody made mention, I think it was a while ago, I've forgotten the documentary, and it was I think it was a slip of the tongue, but you know how this, when they say something, if you're listening, you will catch it. He said it's curious that the last war that was fought on principle was the Second World War. No other war since. All the other wars that have been fought since the Second World War have been wars of access to resources. Look at any of those wars.
I would include the Second World War.
I was about to say too.
Yeah, but okay, yeah, maybe
I was about to say from the get-go.
You're right.
I'm willing to debate the person that said that. Very happily.
No, you're right. You're right. Okay, come to think of it, you're right, because I mean, Germany went to war because it was the Versailles Treaty was unfavorable to its very existence, and the fact that it lost its colonies was also, yes.
They were still fighting over Africa back then.
Yeah, of course, it was. But I mean, when he made mention of that, then you only have to go and look at where their footprints have been to only understand that the extent of what he was talking about. I mean, look at it. Even the toppling of Gaddafi, it was based on the access to oil. And Brother Milton may mention the fact that even before the so-called operation was to kick in, they've already started deciding who gets what and how. So you begin to wonder at what point. But going back to the debt issue, it's funny that Africa has been saddled with these debts, and it's not just the debts that it got post-independence. We should actually look at the debts it inherited pre-independence. Because if we look at the creation of the what's the creation? If you just look at the tenets of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, United States, and the so-called Marshall Plan, what was the collateral for the European countries in getting access to said funds on the Marshall Plan? It was the fact that they basically put up all these colonies as collateral to the United States. And so once you had that in play, the countries, once they got their flag, it was essentially, here is your credit card bill as well. Get on with it. It's like, what? Yeah. Okay, do you need some more? Okay, I'll go and ask Uncle Sam for some more. And then you had the World Bank coming in, deciding what it is you can and cannot do, which, forms the basis of the great book by Brother Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Essentially, this is a play-by-play, it's like the blueprint of what it is we're looking at right now. We've never been allowed to industrialize, not because we don't want to, but because those who have talked of those very idea of industrializing have been done what? Have been gotten rid of. And so if you cannot produce what you need, and then you have to constantly buy or constantly borrow, it's no surprise that we'll rack up such a large, such a large credit card bill in terms of what Brother Milton said earlier. It's 700 plus billion. Can you imagine?
Says it is not payable.
But the most important thing is it's not meant to be paid.
Sankara says it's not payable. In terms of
the people that lend it, it's not meant to be paid. They don't want to be paid. They want you to pay the interest. That's why they keep calling it servicing the debt.
Servicing the debt.
They know nobody can pay $730 billion.
But here's the question I keep asking, and it's an obvious question because every time I ask it, I'm looked at like I haven't said anything profound. But here you're saying, Sankara is telling us, this is not our debt, first of all, because this is a debt that they incurred when they were colonizing and running the countries of Africa. They borrowed, it's their debt. And then they put it on us and continue putting interest on it, a debt that wasn't ours. So you can imagine you own a home, someone comes and takes over your home, and while they are there, they borrow towards that home, and you have this huge debt. They have this huge debt, and then they leave your home and leave you with that debt.
Yep.
And they are apparently saying, now you owe me because I still have some ownership to your home. And you keep paying that debt, and it increases, the interest in it increases, and it's now your debt. And all of us would say yes to that. So that's one thing I always wonder with African presidents. Like, why are we saying yes to that? Like, are we not smart? And I know the answer to that. We are smart because I know I'm smart. I know you're smart. I know you're smart. So why do African presidents keep saying yes to this ridiculousness? The debt is not ours.
Because they don't want to end up 6 feet under.
But again, going back to the United Front, why do they not unite against it?
Yeah, and the enemies of Africa are very clever too. Walter Rodney put it brilliantly. He says they are always one step ahead. So if you're not willing to do the things that will put you one step ahead, which is, of course, which is what you just said, working together and strategizing, they will always be one step ahead. What Sankara was talking about was, how can we get one step ahead? They have the Paris Club, they have the Rome Club,
London Club
of these lenders, financial institutions. Why don't we form the club of Addis Ababa right here at that meeting? That's what he was talking about. So the good thing is that it can be done. That's a good thing. Of course, the bad thing is it's not being done. Yeah. And that's part of the problem why we have this kind of affliction. And also, in terms of the loans taken out, and some of the lenders were banks like Barclays, in Britain.
Standard Chartered should be there.
The big French bank.
Deloitte?
No. The other something. Credit something. I don't know the big
Credit Lyons.
Yes,
I'm not familiar.
They were some of the lenders.
Yeah, Credit Lyons.
When African countries were still colonized, and how Europe underdeveloped Africa details that very well. Walter Rodney. Yeah. Right. The key thing is they're not meant to ever be repaid. So Sankara was saying, we need to have those debts written off. And then once it's written off, we can use our meager resources to develop our economies. There's another quote that I also like, which he says, the debt in its present form is a cleverly organized reconquest of Africa, under which our growth and development are regulated by stages and norms totally alien to us, which addresses what Brother Adesoji was saying. In other words, you are not even allowed to decide what to do with the debt. So you're borrowing. So to go back to your analogy, right? You're in the house now, you inherited the debt, and you incurred more debt because you need to keep feeding your family in your house, right? So they say you can't do this, you can't do that. You can't even manufacture to meet
if you and your wife decide to start producing honey to selling, no,
you can't do that.
No.
And that's why we are having all these marital woes in every African country. That's what's happening, right? The fridges are running empty. Dad doesn't know what to do. Mom doesn't want to do. The kids, and dad and mom are having more kids, by the way, right?
Listen, because that
up,
black love is real.
Looking up at their parents. So you can imagine the disruption in that household. That's how you should see these African countries, And there's a story in the New York Times today about the coup in Niger.
Niger, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, and that's a bunch of nonsense, because the journalist, of course, is not sophisticated enough. Number one. Number two, his newspaper does not really want to tell the true story. So
And
whether
you
the
see who's
journalists want it or
shaking.
not.
You see who's shaking his hand now that he's the new leader. There's like, anyway, Allimadi,
Right.
go on.
Right. So the journalist is writing about, oh, the coups in African countries now stretch an area of 3,500 miles. Oh, impoverished Niger, without saying why Niger is
He's impoverished.
without saying Niger is impoverished because it's providing all the uranium that France needs for its nuclear energy, because France depends on nuclear power. 75% of its energy is produced by nuclear energy.
Imagine
If
that.
France can produce so much on uranium, how can Niger be impoverished? That's not mentioned, of course, in the article, right? Number one. Number two, Niger is under a lot of domestic tension and stress because the army is overstretched trying to fight the jihadis, blah, blah, blah. Without mentioning that, they were not there until France and NATO and the United States went and destroyed Libya.
Yep.
And opened up, you know,
It kind of
base
warms.
nests,
Yeah.
all those weapons flowing left and right. That's not in the story, of course. You know, it's a complete nonsense story. But how many people, without the analysis and background knowledge, would be able to tell that? And that is why a few weeks ago we decided that in the near future we're going to start analyzing and critiquing these articles in the so-called corporate media, because they are part of the agenda.
That would be a good piece to tear apart.
Absolutely.
We can even send our analysis to the writer.
They send the false narrative by not touching on what the real stories are. Right? Back to you, Comrade.
Yes. Which brings us to the issue of, I mean, you've just touched on it there. Why is there debt in the first place? I mean, okay, you know, we know the historical reasons, but in the present tense, why is there debt? Most of those African countries, their economies are structured to produce what they don't want to get what they need. Take the case of beautiful Kenya.
You're always pulling
where they love their.
When it's done, you can hit a West African country by going to Ghana.
I'll go to his home. No.
Where they love
Ghana and cocoa.
Where they love flowers, and coffee and tea so much that they produce it to the point where if the Europeans don't buy, or if the Europeans don't profess love for each other,
right,
who's gonna buy flowers?
Right.
I mean, think of that nonsensical structure.
Nobody's right. Producing the flowers, even at period when the biggest story right now is food shortage in Kenya.
Imagine going all the way to Ukraine for grains.
That wheat used to be grown in those lands. That wheat can be grown in those lands.
I mean,
where the flowers are grown in Kenya.
You can't make this stuff up. You know, I mean, I looked at all the guys who went for that Russia-African summit. Yes, there's a bit of, geopolitics at play. But the main issue why they went there, the grains.
Exactly.
I just sat back and I was laughing. I'm like, do these people actually see their own idiocy right before them?
But do they care?
It says in South Africa, one of the factors that dropped the GDP in South Africa is the Ukraine-Russia war. So you can imagine the desperation.
Yeah, but Adesoji is raising the bigger question. Why should so-called presidents of African countries be running to Russia and Ukraine for grain?
And Sankara kind of points this out when he's talking in a different way. He's talking about the attendance at that conference in 1987 and how some of the heads of state did not show up. And he says they ran to these international meetings. Same thing here, right? You're running to the West for solutions while you have each other.
Running to beg.
You have each other. Why don't you meet and strategize and see how you're going to cut down all those flowers and plant wheat for the next 4 years?
I think we are addressing the wrong people. My own position is we need to encourage our young people to do whatever it takes so that they take the reins of government and do the right thing. and they can actually do it because they'll be willing. They'll be young, dynamic, like Sankara, willing to take a little sacrifice, not having to, like the Ugandan dictator flies to. There's no medicine in the hospitals, right? But flies to Russia, $50 million Gulfstream jet,
He was
but,
proud to land there too. I saw the headline.
but with so-called foreign aid money, you see? So these are the kind of contradictions we need to make our young people aware of and install in their minds. And at the end of the day, what I like also about what Sankara did was to tie in, because we need allies as well. We need allies globally. He says the enemy of African countries are also the enemy of the working class in these industrialized countries. The same ones that are exploiting us in Africa are the same ones that are exploiting them over there. Because as we know, wealth distribution in this country is also very skewed toward the elite. So you have that global dynamics, but then within those industrialized developed countries, you have the same dynamics as well. The elite versus the masses. And then the global elite versus the South elite. That speech is all of less than 10 pages, but it packs so much information. And I hope if you have your copy of the book, hold it up. There you go. I think I have the same edition as well.
I have an electronic copy, so
it's all good.
But yes, it is. I still got the information.
Yes, comrades, wherever you are,
Adesoji does not approve.
It covers so many aspects of what African countries need to do. Not only African countries, by the way. It's a global blueprint for whatever working people are being exploited. That's what Sankara provides.
And then those are his words.
Yes.
No, they're not the words of somebody speaking through an interpreter. They are his speeches.
Speaking of his words, he says, and one of the other reasons we cannot pay this debt is because the debt is attached to regulation and stunting of the growth and development of African nations. And I will try this analogy and see if it fits. You are playing a game, and constantly the referee changes the rules of the game every time you get close to winning.
Of course.
Changes the rules every time. So you just keep playing, getting exhausted, and you can never get to the goal. Because every time he keeps changing the what do you call it in football? What is moved? They move the what?
The goalpost.
The goalpost is moved, but there's another one about American football. Anyway, but you get the point. You never get to the goalpost. And that's the case in Africa. Not only are you handing down your debt as the imperialist colonizer, but now that Africa is attempting to pay the debt, you're saying, no. You cannot do this. So the regulations, the result of the regulations is raised unemployment, lower government revenue, increased cost of basic services, restructuring of tax collections, pension, social security programs. So these are the things you individuals, as you know, that hit your pocket, and that you cannot save money if you're busy catching up with all these other entities. And one of the things that's happening in Kenya right now is small businesses are closing down because they have increased taxation on their income and they cannot manage, and their expenses are increasing. So Allimadi and Adesoji, let's talk about the conditions that are put on this aid that is causing the debt.
Okay, and by the way, in American football, it's the touchline.
There you go, touchline. Okay. Thank you.
So shifting the goalposts, moving the touchline, that was one of the things that they were very worried about when decolonization started in the 1960s. Because now we're going to have potential competitors. During colonial rule, we had made sure that they never industrialized, because many countries industrialized very, very late. Some in the 20th century, you see, because the technology became widely available. Toward the end of the 19th century, Russia was not industrialized. Russia was one of the backward economies. Of course, they did it at a very, high human cost, just like China did as well. but they industrialize. So industrialization is not a mystery. But in order to do so, government has to be involved. So all this talk about, the free market, blah, 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 it's all nonsense. Every country that industrialized historically, there was massive government involvement. The government played the commanding role, in fact, in industrialization. But then they go to African countries, no. The free market will take care of everything, right? They preach that. But they could not enforce it. They could feed the propaganda, but as an African leader, you didn't have to listen to it, right? So if you could get capital, try to industrialize. In fact, industrialization was a major policy in all the initial 5-year development plans in African countries, right? But by the 1980s, when the international institutions, the IMF and World Bank, realized how vulnerable politically these countries were and how desperately in need of capital they were, they started coming up with these conditionalities, structural adjustment, particularly after 1986. So now they give you the money, but this is what you must do. This is what you must not do. So they're controlling your budget now. So what they did is they just yanked back independence, right? Because if external forces are writing your budget for you, if I'm coming to your house and I said, wait, let me see your shopping list, this grocery list you're preparing. Oh, no.
No. This is too extravagant.
That's what they're controlling. How can you tell me you're independent? How can you tell me you're in control of your destiny? And the worst part of it is not only are they telling you what you can do, what you can't do, and of course the prime thing you cannot do is to
industrialize.
Which of course they can't do individually anyway. They would need to come together.
Work in tandem,
in different regional or even continental, right? But that's what they tell you. The second, and to me, this is the most painful aspect actually, that in many countries you have governments that are not representative, don't care about the issues of the working people or the peasants or the farmers, yet they're signing these loans, putting their signatures on it. And who is paying to service the debt? Are those we call the Wananchi in Kiswahili, right? The masses, who don't even have any notion or idea that somebody is signing for a loan on their behalf in Washington, D.C. with the World Bank and the IMF. It's just, it's amazing. It's like, a series of criminal enterprises going on, with men in suits and ties and ladies also in business suits in Washington going through.
The IMF rep who went to Kenya is a woman. Go on.
Yep, and going through men in suits, mostly men, all of men actually, except for Tanzania, right? In the African countries, who now play the role of the former colonial governors. That's essentially what they do.
To add to that, really, you also have to go back to, again, we're going back to the 1980s. And you made mention of the adjustment programs. They were actually called the structural adjustment programs.
Right.
And
that's what I said.
Yeah. So at one point, they were nearly, of the 54 countries, there were nearly at least 32 that were signed up to the IMF drip system. There was actually, there was a series of strikes and industrial actions in Nigeria at the time. I'm talking 1989 now. Then I was in secondary school. And eventually, okay.
No, wait, brother, you can't just slip it by. Like, did you attend? Did you go to the strikes?
Well,
I love the way.
My school principal might be listening.
If you said he was in primary school, then I would say, okay, I'm not expected to be out there.
Allimadi is not letting that one slide.
But secondary school, I expect you to be on the front line, right?
How many scars do you have at Adesoji?
My school principal might still be listening, so because so I'll plead the fifth at the moment.
Go
So
ahead.
so yes, and one of the fallouts of that particular time in Nigeria was the fact that there was like a huge debate. Oh, should we or shouldn't we, take the IMF loan? Should we
Right.
not do this? Shouldn't? So all sorts of what's it called? All sorts of parameters were given. All sorts of nuances were on the line and everything. So the head of state at the time, General Ibrahim Babangida, came out and said, "Oh no, we're not going to take the loan," right? And then initially we didn't take the loan. But here's the thing: we didn't take the loan initially, but before we had gone through what was called, most of the state industries have been sold up. The water corporation, all of them have been
That's one of the
gotten rid of.
conditions they provide. Yes.
The schools, the school funding has been cut. The health budget cut. All of that. And then only for us a year down the line, for the guy to tell us, "Oh, by the way, we have signed off to the IMF loan." But we said we're not going to, So again, and that's just an example in Nigeria, so much so that with that time, what you would then notice was there was a whole lot of aid agency coming into Nigeria.
Right.
So which takes us to which gives us which brings what's his Graham Hancock's book, Lords of Poverty.
Right.
The book about the proliferation of aid, which was one of the first things Sankara got rid of when he came in. It's like, okay, enough. We're not doing this again. You guys stay out. Because if you're giving us aid, and what was his popular refrain? He who feeds you controls you.
Of course.
Yep.
He who feeds you controls you. And he said, okay, you know what? Stop. We're going to restructure the economy. What did he do in Burkina Faso? He took all the land away from the feudal lords and handed it to the people. That's in 3 years. In 3 years. This was a landlocked country. This was a country that barely had resources, was food sufficient. So much so that the United Nations Food Agricultural Program guy came in and said, he's done the unthinkable.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas in Uganda, as we're speaking right now, the government is actually chasing people off their land.
That is crazy. Wait, people,
Two
African
reasons.
people?
Of course, chasing Africans off the land and selling the land off to so-called foreign investors. Right?
Wow.
It was so sad. A year or 2 years ago, a whole community fled and just came and occupied the UN regional offices compound in the town of Gulu, which is 300 miles away from Kampala, and said, "We have nowhere to go. They've kicked us off our land. So we're going to stay here until we make this an international issue and you resolve this problem." So we have the reverse of, apartheid, going on in Uganda. And of course, in other African countries as well. And a lot of these so-called investors are people that also have financing from the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, which is a unit, of the World Bank. And then, of course, the second reason why people are being kicked off the land, we discussed that a few weeks ago, the oil pipeline.
Yes.
People either being kicked off or offered like $15. You can't even get a steak burger with that to leave the land. It's just mind-boggling.
So these are the reasons why I shamelessly go in spaces and speak the way I speak, because we're talking about lives, and these are lives. I have family in Kenya. My mother, my siblings are in Kenya. They're suffering from what is going on in Kenya. So excuse me if I'm going to straight up be pissed off and tell you off if you're working for the UN. or if you're out here as a Black person trying to tell me that these entities are good people when I can see that they're not. And there's one thing to work and you don't know, to be there doing their work that they're doing. Our friend, again, why am I forgetting his name? Tunacheki. We need him here on this conversation because he tells his story about the UN, which is great to have him telling that story. But once you know better, you have to do better.
Right.
Once you know better, you have to hold them accountable.
At the end of the day, we need to empower our people, because when our people are weak, when the governments are weak, because we have many fictitious governments, with officials who live in the capital cities. So you have all the symbols, you have the ministries, you have the automobiles, you have the bodyguards traveling around. So you have the semblance of functioning states, but they're not there, right? They're not connected to the masses, the population. Leave even the urban areas, but go to the rural areas where the majority of our people still live.
And also part of that empowerment culture is the fact that true information is scarce.
Absolutely. And that is why for people like Sankara, literacy was number one priority.
Which is where I'm going next.
Yep.
Which is where I'm going next.
Please do.
With regards to the empowerment, he said one of his popular refrain was, "It is so much that you can provide people what to eat, but also they have to understand that knowing who their adversaries are and also knowing what it is they need to do is important." Is important. Why is that important? It's important in the sense that if a population is devoid of basic education, you are going to be subservient to whoever comes to you. You are. I mean, I come from a country 200 million strong. Education should be free, or at least on paper it is said to be free.
It was free when we were growing up,
but it's not qualitative.
No,
it's not qualitative. So it's so much as, okay, yes, you have an empty school, there's a hole in the roof, the desks are dilapidated, the teachers are not motivated to teach you.
Right.
Yes, you have a school, but you don't have a functioning school.
Right. And to be honest with you, it's the teachers that are motivated. I remember, in fact, you know how young people are very funny sometimes. So we had a choice when I was in third grade to go to a town school in Gulu or to go to the village school. But we opted to go to the village school because most of our friends went to the village school. It has, fewer resources, supplies. But in the village school, we had a brilliant teacher. One of the best teachers I've ever had in my life, I remember, was from primary 3 and primary 4. So if we have teachers like that, it can still be done as resources expand. But even a teacher like that needs to be paid. So when you're not paying teachers, you're paying your soldiers, of course, because you're afraid. If you don't pay your soldiers, they're going to overthrow you, right? So you pay the military, you pay the police, but you're not paying teachers, which of course is a big crisis in many African countries. So I just wanted to interject that, but please continue with the education.
So much so that if you look at the demographics in Africa at the moment, it's skews towards the female folk. It's about 60% female, 40% men. And Sankara was very observant of that factor. With that statement, women are the mothers of our revolution. And so he says, who becomes mothers? Girls. Whatever happens to the girls, they have to go to school. Yes, okay, they get pregnant and what have you, but it takes two to tango. These girls are supposed to go to school for as long as they're able to stand on their 2 feet. And once they have the baby, they are supposed to go back to school. Hand the baby over to a matriarch and go back to school. Was the rule Sankara left. And they stuck to it. so much so that literacy grew so much within Burkina Faso in that 3 years, and that was due, again, devoid of funds, not borrowing, just using basically what you have to get what you want. So why is that debt issue? Why is it an underlying problem for Africa? Brother Milton said it earlier. It is a way of crouching back so-called independence that you've been granted.
Mm-hmm.
They can only tell you what to do if they hold the purse strings.
Absolutely.
The AAU, the budget is financed by external donors.
60%, I think.
Exactly.
Yep.
The ECOWAS
Look who's funding
ECOWAS is basically moribund at the moment because when I was growing up, it used to be everyone contributed. It was the majority of budget was contributed between Nigeria and Ghana, and the others make up the difference. But now that both of them are just like hands off, the place is just like Brother Milton said. Yes, they drive their 4x4s around. They've got their insignia on the cars. They've got the aerials. They've got the flags and what have you. But go to them to say, could you do this? Like, what are you talking about? Do we do that? Are you sure? Speak to you.
No, that's right. I'm a whole minister. Stop bothering me.
First of all, you won't even get to them. You'll be kicked and punched and God.
No, which, by the way, sister, let me just continue on what you said. There's a video out there. I think it also made BBC. Did you see that? I think it was the South African vice president, his bodyguards.
No, I didn't see it.
They just jumped out of the car. I guess because the bystander was standing too close to the convoy or something.
Yeah,
you should have just seen they pummeled him unconscious, and it's
you won't even get to them to air your grievances.
So when you said that, it reminded me of this video that came out last week. But go ahead.
And the contrast of that was what? Was the fact that Sankara every Friday went to a different part of Burkina Faso at the time to take the message to the people. Either they were farming, or they were helping to build dams, or they were planting trees.
Yeah.
They were doing either of those three things: farming, planting, or just basically talking to people.
As you say that, Adesoji, I'm actually thinking, I'm jumping in real quick. Hopefully I don't make you lose your thought. As you say that, I'm thinking of my brother, my younger brother at home and his friends. There's a group of kids, young men in Kenya, where I come from in the village, just hanging around all day. If the Kenyan government today decided to take on projects like those Sankara did, those men have something to do. And you have a lot of youth in Kenya today who would be willing to go to do that, who are available to go do that. And what does that do? It takes them off the streets. It gives them purpose. Them off the street,
but it's also increasing the national production.
Right?
It's actually
again, the GDP goes up.
Right. But you have to have the mindset that is in tuned like that. You have to have somebody who goes to, before he's going to bed, he's saying, what can I do to improve the welfare of my people? That was certainly Sankara.
Yeah.
I wonder how many of those are the so-called leaders of that mindset, because that is something so obvious. But if his mindset is that, let me just drive quickly past these youth that are hanging out in my convoy, right? The problem is going to go away because I don't see it, right? I'm going to drive quickly past them. The problem is that's the type of so-called leadership we have in many of these countries. That's why I said earlier, the good thing is we know it can be done. Sankara in his short life provided us the template and the examples. And that's the template we have to insist on and demand on. I keep going back to the example of Cuba.
I'm glad you're bringing them up.
No, look at the shame of a continent of 1.3 billion potentially vibrant human beings that can accomplish a lot. Have to wait for Cuba to come help us deal with Ebola, to come help us deal with COVID-19. Just think about that.
And you would think the lesson learned, you're hanging out with these leaders, they're speaking to you, and you don't ask them, how do you do it? And they say to you, we make sure that we have well-trained doctors all the time, a good number of well-trained, because I'm sure he told them that. I'm sure he did. We always make sure, because I've seen it in the letters that Che Guevara was writing, that the doctors, we are training a lot of Cubans to be doctors. We never have any shortage in doctors. So why would you as an African president not go ahead and implement that in your country so that you don't need to call them next time?
But I just said it. If you have no love for the people, why would you even bother doing that? We have no shortage of soldiers, nice uniforms, weapons, well-paid, parading on national holidays,
And Sankara asked that question. I'm glad you brought them up. Sankara asked the question.
He is without being able to feed his people.
And I'll expand his question. Why are you buying weapons? The only reason you're buying those weapons is to fight fellow Africans, because there's no African country that is ready or equipped to fight nuclear powers. So why are you buying weapons?
I love that question.
I extend to, why are you increasing your manpower in these armies instead of training doctors when you know the only entities you're fighting are fellow Africans? Why?
Thank you for reminding us of that. He, as far as I know, is the only African leader whom I've ever heard calling for disarmament in Africa. And this is a soldier, a military man saying, we don't need these weapons. We need to invest in
people
and uplifting our economy. The only and the last I heard, right? Which partly also explains why
he was the last.
Exactly. But
that was a good one. We took your time.
Yes. And so when it came to the issue of debt again, which is very salient, it was the fact that, what's his name? Francois Mitterrand came to Ouagadougou on a visit. And at the gala meeting, one of the things Mitterrand said was the fact that Thomas Sankara was an overzealous guy, that he used to be like that when he was young. And I like the response Sankara gave. Sankara said, well, unfortunately, that time is not the one my people have that they can play with. The time here is invaluable, that every minute we waste costs a life. So I don't know, with the greatest of respect to you guys, we don't have that kind of frivolities. And so he was very adamant that they would not take on any loan while he was president. And what was funny about that was, at the time he left office, the debt he inherited was the same debt they had, right?
I saw that, yeah.
And what did they find when he got killed? 2 bicycles, a TV, and an old refrigerator.
You mean he had no Mercedes-Benz?
No, in fact, he banned that
big
for the
mansion
entire
of
government.
Small village of his own with his family?
Yep.
No.
And I'm sorry, this one I have to get a little personal. Like the amount of land
it's all personal.
Your
Allimadi.
former president has.
It is all personal.
Your former president, like his amount of land, like Uhuru, isn't it like half the country?
Uhuru, everywhere you go, oh, this is beautiful. Oh, it belongs to Uhuru. That's beautiful. Oh, it belongs to Uhuru. What are they doing here? It belongs to Uhuru. I'm like, really? Everywhere?
Yeah.
This
is what we need to start teaching people to occupy the land. Yeah.
Now think about that. Your country has, how much is Kenya's debt? Imagine if that land is put to use.
Let me see.
And not growing flowers, of course.
Kenyans.
I'm going back for you to answer your question, Adesoji. Let's see.
I think it's about 40. No, Kenya's debt is about 37.
I took it in Kenya shillings because I refused to honor the dollar. The current external debt is at 5,092 billion Kenya shillings.
So it's
Yeah,
about
but
30.
for outsiders, we would have to translate it.
Okay, so it's
No, I
about
refuse to take the dollar, but go
37
ahead.
it's about 37 billion, 6 billion of which is owned to the Chinese for the infrastructural build-up.
That's what they say.
And
But at
31
least we have infrastructure to show for that. At
Yeah.
least
No,
we have
actually,
that.
Kenya does. I agree.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
What is
at
it
least
as a
we have
percent?
that.
What is
Go
it
ahead,
as a
Adesoji.
percent of GDP? Do you have that?
The percentage of GDP in Kenya is 67.3, 2022, 67.3%.
The
Okay.
debt? The
No,
debt to GDP?
debt to GDP, yes, 67.3%.
That's why they're having a serious crisis. Right?
Yep.
That's way, way,
course.
way too high.
Yep.
of course.
Go
And
ahead,
also is the fact that the only guys who are, hamstringing them that they must pay are your Paris club, not the Chinese.
Yeah.
Which again goes to show what's his name spoke about. Kwame Nkrumah.
We attended an event in Philadelphia. It was an African and U.S. trade relations event. And the representative there is an African woman by outward looks. When she opened her mouth, I realized she wasn't African. But she is being confronted by one of the attendees as far as that issue, Adesoji. The person is saying, an African, because there were Africans at that event from Africa saying, China does this, we like that China does this, we like that China does this, we like that China doesn't do this. And she's there saying, but the debt from China is this. And you have to sit and look at a Black person defending the United States and say, just like you said, Adesoji, yes, Kenya owes China. But when you look at Kenya, we have railway, we have roads that the Chinese have funded. You have things that you can actually show
Right.
And you can point to.
is development. But United States, I look around, I'm like, please show me, please.
No, they can't defend that. In fact, they have no argument for that.
Exactly. So what's his name? Kwame Nkrumah, when he published that book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, also pointed out the fact that all these debts that's been racked up and these companies coming in to, basically call up the check are based on fiat currency that is not used in any shape or form to create development or to empower the people. It is just debt servicing debt. So which brings me back to the issue of most of these African countries in terms of debt. Mali, being a case in point, has so much gold in the French reserves, but is still struggling to pay his debt.
But wait a minute. Mali's gold?
Yeah,
In French reserves? How?
Mali, okay, yes. So part
No,
of the
That's not new. That's
Yeah, but I want him to make the connection for whoever it is new, because I'm certain there's an
West
African
African
who's
country.
just finding this out, like I did when I found out.
part of the arrangement when most of these countries got independence from France, with the exception of Guinea, of course, was the fact that they had their currency tied to, what was it called? The CFA. So 14 countries within the West African region, 2 countries within Central region, another 2 countries in the Indian Ocean by way of Mauritius. Sorry, I said Mauritius. Comoros and what's the other one? Seychelles have their economy tied to the CFA. And those 3 CFA are not even tied together. So basically, you have one for West Africa tied to the French franc, now the euro. You have another one from Central Africa tied to the euro on a standalone. You have another one in the Indian Ocean tied. So
A whole lot of financial confusion.
So whatever those countries get in terms of money goes to Paris. And if they want to build a road or school, they have to write a business case.
Let's go back to my analogy, Adesoji. That house that now is yours, you've gotten it back. So you and your wife are going to work and making an income. But at the end of the month, you have to send it to that person who had taken over. And before you pay school fees for your kids, they have to be the ones to tell you, yes, you can have some.
Yeah, and even when you can have some, it is essentially you borrowing money So you're borrowing your own money.
And not only that, the value of whatever you have in your wallet is dependent on what I do with what I have in my wallet.
Imagine that.
So if the value of the, for whatever reason, of the dollars I have in my pocket, if it, if I buy something on a regular basis from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the person who's selling it to me say, you know what? I've decided to double the price of my things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means the value of my money is in half now, right?
Yep.
Since your money is tied to mine, it means yours is also in half now. Based on my decision.
Yours is reduced 4 times from the price of the product.
Whose price has gone up. If the price went up 10 times and I still want to buy it, I have to pay a lot more for it. It means the value of my money went down. Yours is also going to go down by 10 times. And then they still call themselves independent countries.
Countries, yep.
That's oxymoron.
That's the shocking thing. And
let's look at Ghana for a second. Ghana is
in a whole lot of mess right now.
76% of GDP in 2021. It went down. Now it's 36% of GDP. And the total debt is $30 billion. 30. Zambia was 40% of GDP. And that also went down. In 2020, it was 73%. 73%. And that, of course, is when Zambia defaulted. And that also led to the election, actually, of the new president, Hikilema, who defeated Lungu. And a lot of the issue was related to.
So one thing I didn't realize as I was looking at GDP. So GDP is the gross domestic product, right? It is how many products in that country are you producing from the get-go, and they're going to be used within that country, right?
More or less. It's an aggregation of economic
and services, products and services, because I didn't even know that defense within your country and education is part of the GDP.
Yeah, but if it draws money from your income, then it's deficit.
Yeah, but it's still part of the GDP.
I know it's still, but
so
whether it's productive or not,
Yeah. So no, we're not even talking about whether the services are productive. That you're just servicing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But and so as I looked at the different GDPs, debt to GDPs in the different countries, the thing that kept coming, food prices, food. And we know we've had a show. We talked about South Africa, and we had a couple of shows where we talked about food sufficiency and independence in Africa. So if you are not producing the food, and if your people, again, Sankara, right? We produce what we consume what we produce. If you're not doing that within your country, your GDP is going down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because you're essentially using money you don't have to chase things you want.
And you're bringing food from outside instead of making it within your country. Some of these countries, they're bringing in food that they already have within their country. For example, palm oil. So
you're essentially, to go back to the Kenya analogy, you have to ensure that people buy your flowers in order for you to feed.
And so the thing to do as Kenya, as a government, right? If I was given, how much should I ask for? A month to be the Kenyan president? So that I can show through action how to implement?
You can't do that.
You need a whole month?
You can't do
what
that.
do I need? A year? Should I ask? They'll not give me a year. I just want to show that.
No, you need at least when you're running.
Sankara had 4 years. Give me 4 years. Give me 4 years, like
Sankara had 4 years, but again, Sankara had to abrogate power. Power was, because he had the power and people trusted him.
You forget about all the other factors, right? Say all the other factors are fitting, and I am given to show exactly what I'm talking about. The things we're talking about. If you have flowers and they're not feeding your people, and your GDP is dependent on producing and servicing your people within the country, I'm getting rid of flowers.
Yeah, but sister, don't get too hung up on the word GDP. It's not.
For me, it's more of food production. It's not even the GDP. It's food production. If I know that producing food in my country, forget about whether it's GDP or not, the well-being of my people that they are not dependent on an external entity for their food production.
Right. Okay, so you know what you're telling us, sister, because it's not that these leaders don't know about that, right? The bigger question is who is preventing them from making those decisions, and that's what is so alarming that our listeners need to know that.
And so,
these leaders are being prevented from doing the obvious. So for you come now, you're saying, "Oh, I'm going to feed my people." Somebody's going to say, "Madam President," somebody from Washington
is on the phone.
It's on the phone.
And I'll say, tell them I'm not taking their call. Goodbye.
You're not going to take a call?
Nope.
When you have, what was the Kenya's external debt we just saw?
I'm good with that.
It's about $37 billion.
$37 billion, and you're telling us you're not taking the call.
I actually saw this. This is interesting that our community member Muata Garai, given that we are past the hour, let's involve the community in the conversation.
Yes. Sorry.
I recently, every now and then, when I want to just relieve my mind of all this work, my daughter said the other day to me, which was quite sad, "Mom, I don't want to do what you do. It's so stressful." She said that because she can see how stressed I am by it all. And it's very, very stressful. And for my child to say that, it's a little disappointing, but it's the truth. And I don't blame her for it.
That shows love, actually.
Yes. And so every now and then when I want to take away that stress, I watch, there's a show on Netflix. I'm not in any way saying go watch Netflix. I'm not selling their services, but this is what I use because it's available. It's called Chef's Table. And on Chef's Table, they were showing a Russian chef, and he was talking about this very thing here when Russia was sanctioned and Putin decided to destroy all external produce, and it forced the farmers in Russia to grow their own produce. And their production increased. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm like, why doesn't Africa do this? You'll be in pain for a few months, but before you know it, you'll have your own food. So here, let's talk about it. The irony is that Russia actually became self-sufficient because of the sanctions from the United States.
First of all, the Kenyan elite would drive whoever is president out of power. If Kenya, it's called, in economics, that term is called autarky. Autarky, right? Where you close yourself from the outside world. And they don't want examples like that, And that's the reality. At the end of the day, it's not that we don't know what needs to be done.
We need to strategize.
But they will eliminate you once you start talking like that. And then, of course, they'll accuse you of being a communist.
And it's upon the people, the masses, the larger percentage to stand up for you.
Yeah, it's all tied in together. They have to know. They have to understand. But we keep our people illiterate, partly because of that. It's easier to govern people that are not that well informed. Look at Cuba. Cuba has survived over 6 decades in the shadow of the monster that wants to crush, the Cuban aspiration, And that, in fact, is what empowered Cuba to become self-sufficient. Of course, it got a lot of help from the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was still there, but a lot of it was also because it was building foundational self-sufficiency within Cuba. As the Soviet Union collapsed, yes, the oil subsidy from Venezuela have been very helpful, but their education system, their training system to become as self-sufficient in as many areas as possible, training all these doctors, sending doctors all over the world, to Africa, to some South American countries, the U.S., they even wanted to send here, I think, the U.S. didn't want that because they say, "Oh, this is just propaganda." So yes, sanctions can have positive benefits
effects
if used, in the right way. But you need to have, a government that has a national policy on the same page. The kind of elite, bourgeois regimes we have.
Courage is another thing. For that leader to have courage and that love for his people that Sankara had.
Yeah, he had a deep-seated love for Africa.
I mean, he posed the question, so what's the solution? The solution is we can choose not to pay, which most economists will say. I mean,
and not just that. When you look at the history, because he talks about the Maafa as well, one of the reasons we shouldn't pay, the reparations. This comes in the conversation of reparations, right? When you look at the money coming out of Africa every day in resources. Go on, Adesoji.
Okay, so he was, when he was saying you shouldn't pay, he was going back to the gentleman we spoke about, I think last week, Babu, who cited the odious debt principle. And for those who are not conversant, where it essentially means you refuse to pay debts that has been taken out but has not been used for the reason it was taken out in the first place. You are allowed in economic terms, or alternatively, you can restructure your debt. So most people would not want you to use the odious debt principle, but they want you to restructure. So in the period within which you're restructuring, so you will have a moratorium on your debt. And then you use that time, to build capacity. So when he's saying also that we cannot go it alone, I think he was alluding to the fact, because when I was reading his papers, especially the speak, he kept talking about something. And then, in the end, he let slip. There's a part there where he says, there's this book he was reading. But because, again, when he was killed, people were not privy to, his papers were essentially destroyed. Or rather, we don't know where they are. So, and somebody, what's his name? The guy has now died, Valery Sommet. He's a personal, one of his ministers. He was actually one of the guys who was
probably in France, in Paris. Go on, though.
So he was one of the guys who was in the room but left just before the shooting started. The guy will later die in Congo. Valery Sommet, in his book, The Assassination of Thomas Sankara, alludes to the fact that he would see Sankara reading this book.
That makes sense. So
you would see that being a leader is not just, you also have to read. So he read extensively. He said Sankara would read. He's coming in, Sankara will look up from his desk sometimes, he's reading, making notes. And then if anybody comes into the room, he puts a file over the book he's reading because he doesn't want them to see, that kind of thing. He was very cagey like that. I'm sure in the day of social media, we would have found out what sort of books he was reading, but this was long before. Now, why is that important? It's important in the sense that Cheke Adediop in this book, Black Africa, the case for a federated economic and social state, points out everything every African country should do. Come together, build resources. One area of the continent will generate power. Another ones will produce food. And then you trade based on your needs. The issue of this debt will be a long gone conclusion. Some people will say, but that is, you're living an utopian lifestyle. Yeah, but the Europeans do it in the EU. That's what they do. They have the common agricultural trade policy. The United States has its own subsidy program for his farmers. Why can't we have the same thing in Africa? Again, it goes back to the issue of the debt. Every time they come, they put money on the table. The first thing they ask you to do is, you need to stop doing that. Yeah. For the betterment of your own people, you need to start doing that. And so, if my people stop producing food, guess what would happen? We would need to buy. If we're not buying, we will need to go and beg, which is what happened in Russia. Imagine a place like Zimbabwe, a place like Kenya.
With all the fertile land.
Even Brother Milton's favorite president, Yoweri Museveni, was there in St. Petersburg.
I'm surprised he's receiving it so well.
went to St. Petersburg.
I've torn him sufficiently already.
He gave him his share today.
Went to St. Petersburg, bowl in hand.
Mhm.
These are guys with some of the most fertile soils on the African continent.
The most, not some.
You know,
At the end of the day, what we need is to have Sankara like-minded
Exactly.
Africans to come together. And
We need
to
a
have
Sankara
enough-
infection in Africa.
And then they can actually, at one of the AU meetings, have a real declaration of independence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Finally.
Because these countries are not independent.
Mhm.
Because everything we are saying, if somebody was listening for the first time, would realize that we're discussing countries that are not independent.
Mhm.
They're not independent to make the decisions that affect their people, decisions on the economy. That's the bottom line. Everything else is a technical issue. If you can't decide on what you want to produce, you're not independent. The United States, China lends the U.S. $900 billion, right, by buying U.S. treasuries.
Mhm.
It's only number 2 after Japan. I think Japan is $1.1 trillion. Does China say, oh, because I lend you $900 billion, this is what I want you to do concerning your budget?
Imagine that. Can you imagine if they dared?
Of course not. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the U.S. saying,
Right?
China, you're subsidizing, you're undercutting your production, you're underpaying labor, and that is why you're able to sell goods for cheap in the U.S. and destroy our economy.
You would think the Africans would learn.
They say that because it affects the national interest. And they talk about free market, all that nonsense. There are certain U.S. industries that China is not allowed to participate in.
Uh-oh.
There are certain U.S. companies involved in certain industries that if China wants to buy, the U.S. has to review first, and the U.S. often makes the decision denying China the right to buy. So what is this nonsense about?
Pull that up from...
all this nonsense about,
I'll pull that up from as you were talking, I remembered one of
market,
our community members had commented on that
he's
market.
Absolutely right. They do not rely on it. They preach what they don't practice to African countries. And yet African countries are supposed to practice that. Otherwise, they're penalized. It's the worst type of hypocrisy.
But here goes logic, right? You've been doing this for 5 years where you said, okay, yes to free market, because maybe you didn't understand what it meant. But in 5 years, you see that free market means if I am the palm oil producing nation, they're bringing their companies producing palm oil and selling it and destroying my market. Now your palm oil industry is destroyed. That 5th year, when they come to ask you to sign, you will sign again?
Of course you will.
No, but I'm saying logic and the well-being of your people.
The well-being of our people. I think we discussed that already.
Will
they
you,
don't care
Allimadi?
about the well-being of the people.
We are now pretending you are the president, Allimadi. You have seen in 5 years the effects of that.
I would have to have a revolutionary government. I would have to have a revolutionary government.
You don't sign that paperwork when you see the
rejects
effects.
The neoliberal IMF World Bank regime from that position. So it's not a question of this year, do I decide to do this or that year. You have to have a certain type of government. If you have the type of governments that we have right now, neoliberal Western governments imposed on African countries, then of course they'll sign because they'll just be continuing to do what the Western government is doing.
My observations are more for the people of Africa to start asking the right questions and to start voting the right people in. And when you go and they talk to you about this, you look at their resume. These people have been in government for years. Ruto was in government for years. You look and ask Ruto, what have you done for Black people? What have you done for Kenyan people?
Look at the Kenyan elections. Let me give you another example. And people can go back and look at the New York Times articles beginning 2 weeks before the election. Yeah. In every article, they make sure to refer to Raila as a socialist.
I know that makes
Socialist.
me. And Kenyans believe
They
this.
do that with a purpose. That is not done accidentally. You know, before the campaign, he was never referred to as a socialist. But now, 2 weeks before the election. So I think that partly answers your question as well.
And unfortunately, a good number of Kenyans that I'm speaking with believe this. I keep saying to them. And also, we as Africans, unfortunately, expect perfection of leaders when we ourselves are not perfect. Raila has flaws. All of them have flaws. But if you have a leader that is looking at issues that are hitting the pockets of Kenyans and addressing them and saying we need to talk about this and holding the government accountable, why are you as Kenyans, who are the ones suffering, not following that leader to address the issues?
Somebody on Twitter, somebody accused me of being a Marxist. And then I asked him, I said, and what does a Marxist mean?
He didn't even know. He said, I know it's bad.
Was that their real response? Honestly, they said, I know it's bad?
I don't know. Yeah, that was the response.
I mean, Sankara in one of his interviews said it take, I think it also was the title of this book, A Certain Amount of Madness. He says it takes a certain amount of madness for you to act with clarity on certain issues. I want to be part of that mad people, because to do so means we'll be able to invent the future. So when we're talking about the issue of debt, we have to be willing to invent the future. So speaking of the future, he prefers the solution that Africa has to come together in a concerted effort, because you cannot do it alone. You cannot do it alone. And to do so means, yes, there will be pain. As like he said it before he left that meeting, if I went alone, I might not be here tomorrow.
Yep.
I might not come back for the next meeting. But if we do it together, we'll be here, backslapping each other, congratulating each other.
Imagine that.
But as they would say, history reveals itself to be, to be what it is. And the guy eventually was, taken out.
And it finds us lacking. History finds us lacking in this moment.
But I'm hopeful, because now a lot of these conversations are happening in social media space.
In spaces they never did.
A lot more people are involved in the conversation. Young people are becoming much more insistent and demanding in African countries. I think a few of the elite leaders may want to take advantage of that. I think if we have 4 or 5 African leaders who seriously talk, amongst themselves and say, let's expand this circle, right?
Yep.
It would be very difficult for other African leaders to refuse to become a part of this process.
Especially if it's one of those big nations.
Right, exactly. If
one
they
of
come
those
together,
big nations, yep.
If Nigeria, but of
South
course,
Africa.
I think we need another president, not the guy who claims he's 70, although he
change of leadership before Nigeria
like
comes
90 years old. He claims he's 70. I doubt that.
Stop being an ageist, Allimadi, yeah?
No, I'm proud of my age. I never conceal my age.
Yeah, but
stop shaming the man for being old.
My president is very young.
No, for lying about it.
Again, that's Nigeria.
But no, really. If we have Nigeria, if we have Ghana, we have South
Africa,
we have
Kenya.
Come to Ethiopia, come together.
Yeah, Addis Ababa.
This is our plan of dealing with this debt crisis.
Instead of running to Russia, to BRICS, make something yourselves, Africa.
Right. Make it yourself. And they have a common demand, these 5. It can easily expand to 10. And then it will start putting pressure on the other ones, And they must insist on debt cancellation. But once you get rid of that, you still have to deal with the next day, which is a question you raised when we were discussing and planning this show. You need to do a number of things. You need to then deal with the the terms of trade, the exploitative terms of trade that African products are subjected to, right? On the other hand, you need to do your homework at home too and start coming in these the regional entities already exist. Put teeth into that, so they can start, focusing on regional industries. Get the billions of dollars stolen and are in tax havens. If Western governments cooperate on something like that, a lot of that money can be recovered and then returned back. And as we said earlier, look at all these contracts that are being signed for these valuable mineral resources.
That's a job for someone right there. Start a committee in each of these African countries. Start a united committee that will look into these things. For 4 years, at least we will have 4 years where we're planning towards a good future than not doing anything.
And then, of course, the most important thing is we need alternative sources of finance, which are not the World Bank and the IMF.
Exactly.
And that's why I'm following with interest this whole discussion with the BRICS, the BRICS countries, discussing how to have
finance development and
currency basket. So these are things that need to be tackled going forward, because getting the debt canceled is only one part of the struggle. What are you going to do the day after to prevent?
And Sankara talks about
falling
that.
back in the same
Sankara actually does say that. He says refusing to pay the debt is just the beginning.
Right.
It is just the beginning. Adesoji.
Yes. Sankara, debt, Africa. Question is which way forward? A host of leaders have been going through their own, and unfortunately, what's his name? Menas.
You said that and you reminded me of this. I know we're talking about Africa, but this is very, very applicable to Africa, honestly. But go on, Adesoji.
Okay, but unfortunately, what's his name? Mele Zenawi. If he was around, because you mentioned Ethiopia, that would have been another very brilliant mind. But hey, again, he's gone. Magufuli, gone. Samora Machel, gone. Thomas Sankara, gone. Kwame Nkrumah was the first. He documented what the problem was.
But we have
But their spirits and their words are with us. And it's upon us now to take on that.
Yes.
And not just myself, Adesoji and Allimadi, but as Africans, wherever we may be.
I see a comment by Good Luck
Mwashilindi.
And he mentioned Nyerere. And Nyerere, yes, of course, was one of my heroes as well. And he says, Africa must be one and not so afraid to make a stand. I agree totally. Resources must be pulled together and the industries built in each of the 4 blocks. Similarly, electricity production infrastructure is Africa. Yes.
He's talking about South Africa, West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. I agree.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, part of it is the knowledge base. And that's why we think having these type of conversations on Kumbukeni
is very important.
It's really important, adding to the knowledge base and inspiring our young people. I've been invited 2 or 3 times to do a podcast from a young Tanzanian brother who first saw me on the podcast. So, we are actually reaching young people on the continent as well.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I always share the podcast. It's not just Kumbukeni, it's all the African voices out there that are making known the atrocities going on, that are putting it in plain language for us all to understand. For my mother sitting in Kenya and my brothers to send me this link that I shared with you all and say, oh, now we're starting to understand what's going on. That's what we need. And if you come across them, don't just subscribe and like, but share them so that more Africans can see them. We are an army. I'm not even joking. We are an army at war. Let's get to it. Any last words, brothers?
Yes.
I'll
go out with the words of Sankara. You almost remember, he who feeds you controls you. So try and break away from that. That's me. And speak to you next week.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic. At the end of the day, we have all the resources that the world needs. The only problem is the world does not want to pay for the resources that we have. It is our duty to insist that our leadership make sure that they pay for the resources that we have.
And echoing Sankara, we produce what we consume what we produce. African countries start producing, stop getting in those jets. The amount of money you pay for the jet, you can literally pay for a farmer to start producing wheat and have it in a few years.
Yeah.
The amount of money you pay for the jet, you can give subsidies. That's one thing that was taken away with this current financial bill in Kenya, the subsidies to corn production in Kenya, which is a staple. Corn flour is a staple in Kenya. So you can imagine how it's hitting the people. Thank you all for joining us. Again, if you need to reach us, kumbukeni1@gmail.com. If you're interested, we say this all the time. Don't you go complaining that you are not included in Allimadi's discussions of the different articles. If you're interested, send an email to kumbukeni1@gmail.com. You want to join our Patreon family, we'd appreciate that. Patreon.com/Kumbukeni. And again, subscribe so that this channel can be seen by more Africans at youtube.com/@Kumbukeni1. Asanteni.
Actually, one final word also. If any of our supporters know of a hot topic that they think we should be tackling that we may not have thought of yet, please also send us an email message. Sister, could you give them the email again?
The email is kumbukeni1@gmail.com. And Kumbukeni is just as you see it on our channel. Kumbukeni1@gmail.com. And Kumbukeni is the Kiswahili word for remember, which is what we do every single day. Again, thank you. Kwaherini, siku njema.
Luta continua.
Yeah.